Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, November 16th, 2024. We have a knowledge-packed hour ahead of you with 3 interviews curated by our very own treasure trove of wisdom, historian and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne. First up, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Albert Camarillo, Leon Slaus Jr. Memorial Professor Emeritus of History at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, and author of the book Compton in My Soul, A Life in Pursuit of Racial Equality. Then, he'll be in conversation with Thomas Blakeslee, PhD candidate at Harvard University in Massachusetts and specialist in Black masculinity studies with an emphasis on Black fatherhood. And lastly, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Kali Nicole Gross, NEH Professor of African American Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and author of the book Vengeance Feminism, The Power of Black Women's Fury in Lawless Times. We have a lot of valuable historical gems for you as usual, so keep your ears right here. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Reflection Eternal, Horace Silver, Wayne Shorter, Yusef Lateef, and Marcus Miller. Now, people get ready for this train a-coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Albert Camarillo.
For KPFK Pacifica, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Albert Camarillo, Leon Slaus Jr. Memorial Professor Emeritus of History at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, and author of the book Compton in My Soul, A Life in Pursuit of Racial Equality. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Camarillo.
Thank you, Gerald. Delighted to be with you.
And it's a delight to have you. So why did you write this book, Compton in My Soul?
Well, there were a few reasons. One of which is there are very few memoirs or autobiographies left by Latinos of my generation, especially those that went into higher education. So I wanted to leave that account so that younger generations get a sense of the longer narrative of people of color, Latinos in particular, as they come of age in the second half of the 20th century and are among the very first, like myself, to go to college. Another reason is to provide people with a bigger perspective about the city that people think they know, which is called Compton. So it's both the historical context of Compton when I was growing up there in the 50s and 60s, and then its dramatic change over time, and then going back to Compton to really try to get an understanding of this place that is my hometown in the early 21st century.
So Compton today is known as being the home of personalities such as the tennis-playing Williams sisters, Dr. Dre, Coolio, NWA, Kendrick Lamar, and also George W. Bush. But this was not the Compton of your youth, as I understand it.
Well, Compton of my youth was a very different place. It was not unlike most suburbs in the burgeoning Los Angeles metropolitan area of the post-World War II decades. That is, it was predominantly white. It was highly segregated. I was born into the Mexican-American barrio, and as I learned much later, as I went to UCLA and understood these things and did research, that it was because of racial restrictive covenants that began to be systematically applied in the 1920s and 1930s, that Mexican Americans, Mexican origin people, my family included, were restricted to this little portion of a neighborhood in Compton. By the time I was born in 1948, it was beginning to change, but before that, African Americans simply were excluded from the city. So there's enormous change in the 50s and 60s of which I was a part.
So describe that demographic evolution of Compton from George W. Bush to Professor Camarillo to Dr. Dre. Did deindustrialization play a role in this process? That is to say, factories and manufacturing facilities abandoning that vicinity?
Yes, excellent question. I'd say there's three important interrelated developments that changed the profile of Compton's demographics from the 1950s through the end of the 20th century. First and foremost was the breakdown of the laws and the practices that kept people of color out of that predominantly white suburb before World War II. So African Americans begin to move into a portion of West Compton, and the other factor is something that we know, block busting. Once African Americans or other people of color are able to penetrate formerly white neighborhoods, realtors take advantage of this, and basically the fear that they instill in homeowners, you better sell your property right away because the quote-unquote Negroes or the quote-unquote Mexicans are going to be here and your property value is going to decline. That was enormously at work in the 1950s and early 1960s in Compton. People refer to it as white flight. In Compton, I refer to it as white exodus. And then you mentioned, Gerald, deindustrialization. By the 1970s, you begin to see this amazing industrialization that had transformed the Los Angeles metropolitan area and many others, but especially a place like California and Los Angeles during World War II, began to decline. So auto industry, aircraft industry, other major employers began to decline through the 70s and 80s. People were moving away, and you have the working class and the middle class of all races moving away. In Compton, by 1970s, it's overwhelmingly African American with a smaller Mexican American Latino population, but increasingly a poor population.
So you mentioned that Black and brown people were segregated in Compton. Was it the segregation of Dixie? I mean, for example, were there separate water fountains, for example? Describe when, how, why of segregation in Compton during your upbringing.
What people of color encountered in Compton as I was growing up was a version of Jim Crow that had migrated south with the Great Migration as hundreds of thousands of Black folks leave the South. They go north, but they also come west. People have referred to it as a version of Jim Crow. And it wasn't as much restrictions by law, but by culture and practice. So that if an African American, and this is a true story, an African American family in 1953, I think it was, buys into and is sold a property in an almost entirely white neighborhood, there's people lining up on the front lawn, throwing bottles and rocks through the window to intimidate those folks so they'd leave. They didn't leave. But that was the kind of discriminatory treatment. It was clear harassment to keep them out, but the tide was turning. For Mexican Americans, it's also a vision Jim Crow. I call it Jaime Crow. And again, it was systematic from Texas to California, again, by custom and practice. And my parents, coming to Compton in the 1920s, saw it with the signs that said no Mexicans allowed, or no Mexicans and Blacks allowed. Or by custom, you sat in the upstairs of the Compton Theater because that's where people of color in the 1920s, it would have been Japanese and Mexican Americans, sat up in the balcony. They were not allowed to sit with white folks in the main aisles. So that was the kind of discrimination that was beginning to break down by the time I was coming of age as a youngster in the 1950s.
So who were the Compton Cowboys?
It's interesting that people cannot put the two things together. Cowboys in Compton? Well, there was a portion of Compton, the second neighborhood where my family moved, called Richland Farms. And the founders of Compton wanted to keep this little portion, this neighborhood of Compton, semi-rural. So it was zoned to have cattle, sheep, chickens, and horses. And though there was a transition in the racial demographics of Compton in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that tradition held on, and African Americans, Black folks, started to take up that tradition of horsemanship. And it became a group of people, black men predominantly, who were coming together and using as kind of a community building, cultural activity to ride horses together in portions of Compton.
Finally, Professor Camarillo, author of the book Compton in My Soul, you are an alumnus of Dominguez High School. When were you there? What was the racial and ethnic composition of that institution while you were there? And perhaps allude to your migrating further north to Westwood, where you engaged in your post-secondary study.
Well, Dominguez High School in the mid-1960s was overwhelmingly white. There were no, by 1963, 64, virtually no Black students there, despite the fact that Compton was well over 50% black, but on West Compton. So the realtors, just to give you an idea of this, and to explain why Dominguez was a segregated white high school, the realtors in the early 1960s in Compton said, all right, we're going to divide the city in half. We'll let the blacks and the Mexicans keep West Compton, but we're going to keep them out of East Compton. And part of that was the development of, or the building of Dominguez High School in the late 1950s as the white high school on the east side. Now, I hadn't planned to go to Dominguez High School. I had planned to go to Compton High School, where all my brothers and sisters attended. But my sister convinces my father to move, and I end up at Dominguez High School, the segregated white high school. But it begins to change by the time I'm a junior and a senior. And when I'm a senior in 1965 and 66, the Compton Unified School District decides it's time to desegregate. So African-American kids now from the west side, where I had spent the first 15 years of my life, are now being bused over to Dominguez High, and it causes a lot of tension, right? I knew a lot of these kids because when I was at a middle school on the west side, they were 7th graders when I was a student leader at Walton Junior High School as a 9th grader. So I knew these kids, and it was, again, the story of segregation, desegregation, and resistance to bringing people of color to a high school that had been segregated. Then my journey to UCLA was, it was pre-affirmative action. So for a kid of color to be at UCLA, a great university, about 20 miles north of Dominguez High in Compton, but it seemed light years away when I went there. Among the 28,000 students when I entered, there were about 50 Mexican Americans, about a half, maybe 100 African Americans. So it was a very different kind of institution. Within 10 years, it changes significantly with the diversity of the student body, the incorporation, the institutionalization of affirmative action admissions, which begins to change the profile of that campus.
Well, Professor Camarillo, Sloss Memorial Professor Emeritus of History at Stanford University and author of the book, Compton in My Soul, thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Camarillo, for your knowledge and perspective. You are tuned in to Freedom Now on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. And we are going to keep this train moving, sending you back over to Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined by Thomas Blakeslee. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Thomas Blakeslee, PhD candidate at Harvard University in Massachusetts and specialist in Black masculinity studies, especially Black fatherhood. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Thomas Blakeslee.
Hello, thank you for having me, Professor Horne.
Thank you for joining us. And so what is the theme, the through line, the overview of your work?
Okay, so my current project is on the topic that I've termed radical paternity. Radical paternity borrows from Darlene Clark Hines and others' concept of resistant masculinity, which possibly we'll get into later, which argues that African-American masculinities were forged in the crucible of chattel slavery and Jim Crow oppression, among other things. I use that idea to focus on African-American fatherhood from the mid-19th century through the mid-20th century to show that Black men's positions in their families were shaped by those same elements. And I aim to show how many intellectuals use fatherhood as a rhetorical tool in Black liberation discourses. So overall, the long story, in my opinion, of Black liberation and uplift often centers on Black fatherhoods without ever foregrounding their perspectives. And historians often work around this dimension of gender analysis while problematizing masculinity. So I hope to insert my work into that conversation.
So what were the barriers to successful Black fatherhood?
Barriers are pretty much what you would expect, especially during slavery, that there obviously was no room for expression or for Black men to hold any sort of position of authority. I actually came to this idea of studying this topic because of a quote that I found, which I'll paraphrase from Frederick Douglass in My Bondage and My Freedom, where he said that slavery has no use for either fathers or families, and that when they do exist, they are not outgrowths of slavery, but are antagonistic to that system. So I wanted to, with regard to slavery, analyze that quote and sort of bring it to life with actual examples from narratives, and sort of back away from that a little bit to get a more panoramic view of how that may have applied to other forms of oppression after slavery.
Would you say there's a continuing negative legacy of what you just described?
I would say that, yes, there is a continuing negative analysis of Black fatherhood, not only within the academy, but also in popular conversation. I think Black masculinity, especially right now as we're in an election season, often comes up to be something that is criticized or disparaged for whatever phase of evolution it's in at that time. With regard to the Black liberation movement, it's often at times of calls for change and uplift that masculinity comes back into the conversation as something to be criticized.
Criticized how?
Well, I would say in the present day, since about the 1970s on, it's been criticized in the sense that, and Tommy Curry, the philosopher at Edinburgh University, talks about this a lot, that Black masculinity is often equated to this mimetic thesis of Black men trying to emulate or imitate white patriarchy in its most negative expressions with regard to trying to dominate or oppress others, and sort of aligning with the worst characteristics of white patriarchy. In the present day sense, that would be with far right ideas or oppressing a woman's right to reproductive rights and things of that sort. So that's been in the conversation a lot lately. I've been trying to disengage from the political, but it often does come up.
Mm-hmm. So how does Black fatherhood differ from other versions of fatherhood?
So in my research, it's different because, first of all, it's not encouraged in the sense. So that I'll start with where I start in my research, which sort of does go back to the quote that I started with from Frederick Douglass, that Black fatherhood is often antagonistic to the system. So the first time that we actually encounter the idea of a Black family formation is in the 1662 Virginia House of Burgesses statute that we now call Partis Sequitur Ventrum. So many scholars have analyzed this rule to show Black women's centrality in the slave order. However, historians often overlook how that rule implicitly wrote Black fatherhood out of the law when they determined that the condition of slavery was to be inherited from the mother to the child. So this law denied Black men their identity as fathers, as well as the privileges and responsibilities of fatherhood. And I argue that was central to the slave regime's project of social death. So that is the background that backs up my argument that the very claim to fatherhood, especially in the 19th century, was a radical act of resistance. Black fathers during slavery were also unique in their tendency to establish their families or reconstitute their families by either running away, revolting, purchasing freedom, and military service later on, especially with the Civil War. So this sense of fatherhood, which I call radical paternity, is often crafted through acts of resistance, where other sorts of fatherhood, white fatherhood or immigrants' fatherhood practices did not have to undergo that same sort of crucible.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by resistant masculinity?
So resistant masculinity, as I said, is an idea not started by me. It's an idea promoted by scholars like Darlene Clark Hind and Ernest Jenkins, which is an idea of manhood being forged through resistance to white oppression, where gender norms or gender roles in different eras of historical development had to be supported by society as a whole in order for men and women to find their full expression of manhood or womanhood, where Black manhood, the term that was most popularly used in the 19th and early 20th century, it was constantly crafted to be a subordinate masculinity, beholden to white patriarchal norms. So in that sense, a Black man was not dominant in society or even in his own household. So he was often beholden to the power of white authority, white male authority more often, but also white female authority, especially with regard to plantations in the times of enslavement. There are scholars who have more recently explored ideas of white female authority on plantations over enslaved men.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assunta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
In preparing for this interview, Thomas Blakeslee, I stumbled across a review essay you did concerning the question of sexual violations of Black men. Recount some of the points that you would like to share with regard to what you wrote.
Okay, so you're referring to Thomas Foster's book, Rethinking Rufus, which is a book about sexual violations of enslaved men. I think he did an excellent job of highlighting issues in the study of slavery that often go overlooked for some of the same reasons that I was mentioning earlier. Any discussion of masculinity or manhood, even in the realm of Black studies, seems to be a reification of patriarchal thinking, where he actually looks at Black male subjects more closely to see how they were not sort of trying to emulate patriarchal norms, that actually they, in some cases, were identified as victims alongside women for sexual violation. So the title comes from an interview with a woman who was forced to reproduce with a man named Rufus. And in that sense, most scholars look at her story as one of Rufus being complicit in the abuse of Black women, where Thomas Foster looks at it as Rufus was also a victim of sexual violation in that case. So with forced breeding, that's also an instance of a man not having autonomy over his own reproductive system. And the book also gets into men being victims of male-on-male rape as well, and different forms of subjugation that were targeted towards Black men as men because they're men.
Anything to share with regard to queer masculinity?
Okay, so in my study of fatherhood, which really has just consumed me for the past several years, I really haven't lifted my head to read anything aside from what I'm working on right now. In my work that I'm working on right now, no, there's not much mention of that. Everything is very much in the 19th century, early 20th century conversation of standard definitions of masculinity at that time in manhood. However, I would say most of the conversation of Black masculinity at that time would constitute a queer masculinity as well, because it is out of line with the standard definitions of their own time. For example, Black masculinity is always under review for how well it aligns with contemporary views of manhood masculinity. People like Nathaniel Shaler, all the way up through even some of the women who were in the suffragist movement analyzed Black masculinity as a subordinate sort of masculinity that is more on par with womanhood than it was with manhood. So in that sense, I try to apply, a queer theory sort of approach to how I'm looking at literature that really tried to stay away from that concept, in the late 19th century, early 20th century.
Finally, Thomas Blakeslee, PhD candidate at Harvard, specialist in Black masculinity studies, especially Black fatherhood. What's next on your research agenda?
For this project, I'm working on a chapter now where I'm looking at the ways in which fatherhood and masculinity in general were not all positive, unifying, or uplifting ideas. So for example, intellectuals used family structure, paternal responsibility, and gender roles as rhetorical tools in class-based conflicts between African Americans. And many intellectuals saw the lack of Black patriarchy as both the cause and effect of urban poverty. So this idea often put the onus of uplift on vulnerable families without wealth, education, or moral support. I'm also looking at rhetoric and imagery as a major theme that I'd like to explore in my closing chapter. So I'm looking at Black movement leaders like Noble Drew Ali, Marcus Garvey, and organizations of the early 20th century. So a lot of these patriarchal figures attracted large followings that assumed roles as surrogate father figures in the lives of their followers, which is reflected in some of their names like Daddy Grace, Father Divine, Master Farad Muhammad. And I'm also looking at a lot of Prince Hall Freemason publications where they issue manifestos urging their members to take up responsibility for racial uplift through their family practices.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thomas Blakeslee, PhD candidate at Harvard University, specialist in Black masculinity studies. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Professor Blakeslee, for joining us this Saturday. For you listeners out there, we are not done yet. it's time to send you back over to Dr. Horne for yet another piece of knowledge for you. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Collie Nicole Gross, NEH Professor of African American Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, and author of the book, Vengeance Feminism, The Power of Black Women's Fury in Lawless Times. Thank you for joining us on KPFK Los Angeles, Collie Nicole Gross.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
And it's wonderful to have you. So, what is vengeance feminism, and why did you write this book about it?
This is a great question. So, in a nutshell, vengeance feminism refers to the actions that Black women took to avenge themselves against racist and misogynistic wrongs. But at the same time, it's also about avoiding as much as possible being disciplined by the state, particularly since the state failed to protect them or to afford them any kind of justice in the first place. And this type of activity was not respectable. So women fought back in a literal sense. It's not just figuratively. And in terms of the inspiration for the book, I felt in this particular moment, I felt an urgent need for new kinds of historical narratives about Black women. So we have a lot of histories that look at Black women who have triumphed and persevered, and these are super important. We need that. But a lot of our histories also look at the ways that Black women have been victimized and subject to all manner of injustice without any real redress. And that's true. But I personally needed these stories in this moment. I wanted to see stories where Black women did not just die at the hands of abusers or get railroaded by the justice system. That it was important to look at Black women who found ways to take control of their lives and defend their own honor, to take control of their own reproductive systems. You know, I wrote this book because I want America to get accustomed to histories and stories where Black women fight back and win.
What do you mean by badger thieves?
Okay, so badger thieves, this is a type of crime, particularly late 19th or early 20th century, although there are various iterations throughout history where women pretend to be prostitutes to lure men into compromising positions and then ultimately rip them off. Right. And so in my area of study, what I found is that Black women badger thieves seem to specifically target white men. And initially I thought this was because white men made the most money then as now. And there is truth to that. But they also found this unique way to kind of turn the misogyny of the era on its head. Because if and when women were arrested, a lot of times men didn't even press charges. They didn't want to have to admit what happened and why. But even when they did, at the time, the courts really frowned on any sort of interracial sex. So they actually felt that the men got what they deserved. And so a lot of times the thieves, Black badgers were released. So for me, it's this ingenious kind of crime also.
Mm-hmm. Now, weapons of choice of these women, razors, pistols, hatchets, blackjacks, a note or two on each, if you don't mind.
Okay, so the razors happen quite often. A lot of times I find that this usually is brought out in self-defense, typically in fights or skirmishes that break out, a lot of times in clubs or illegal parlors. But the knives and the hatchets, this happens a lot genuinely in the home. And that's one of the things that I was struck by when I wrote the book, that a lot of the times, some of the most deadly violence that Black women faced was in their households from partners. And so they grabbed whatever was handy to defend themselves. A lot of times it was, a knife or a hatchet. And so like Lizzie Fisher, when her partner came home drunk and wanting to fight and trying to, smash a chair over her head, she ends up fighting with him and ends up stabbing him to death with a butcher's knife.
What about pistols?
The pistol, so this is a funny moment where there were so a lot of times Black women purchased secondhand pistols, typically for self-defense, but usually, actually, I will take that back. So usually when they purchased the pistols, it seems like they did so deliberately. They were at the point where they weren't intending to, in fact, use it against a person. Like knives, hat pins, razors, these tended to be the kind of weapons that they either grabbed in the heat of the moment in a fight at home, or they carried just on their personal, on their selves for protection. But in the instances I've encountered, usually when Black women resorted to pistols, it was with the real intention. Someone had done them wrong and they decided that they were going to avenge themselves. So they went and purchased a secondhand pistol, sought the person out, and shot them.
So what do you mean by these women, or some of these women, play acting for courts and reporters?
Great, thank you for this. This is a great question. One of the things that I argue in the book is that vengeance feminism, that Black women fought back, certainly physically, but also they mobilized every weapon at their disposal. So, if they could rally community support to help them out if they got arrested, they would do that. And they also mobilized, any skills at their disposal, including sort of acting and feigning, fragility and remorse and doing anything humanly possible in the courtroom. So Black women were skating up a hill whenever they went to court in Philadelphia, because the mainstream attitudes were that Black women were guilty and criminal and just thoroughly unjust. And so in order for them to kind of overcome these sort of inherent biases in how these justices and juries looked at them, some Black women really knew how to turn it on in the courtroom, right? So really crying, really trembling, showing, evidencing fragility in a way that kind of conveyed womanhood and femininity, in the hopes that this would sort of counteract sort of the racism that they were up against.
Now, you make reference to laws that sanction sexual abuse of Black women. What did you mean by that?
Right. So one of the things that I argue in the book is that the legal system has never really served Black people in the United States, right? It has never been equitably applied to Black people. And this is particularly, of course, the case during enslavement. One of the things that I argue is I look at rape laws that took place all across the country, but I especially highlight the laws in Philadelphia, because usually when people talk about rape and slavery, everyone automatically thinks it's the Deep South, right? They don't think about New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. But these places also suborned enslavement and also had a particularly vile and biased legal system. And so in Pennsylvania, they had colonial laws that had specific punishments for the rape or attempted rape of a white woman or a white girl. And depending on the race of the perpetrator, so if it was a Black man or a white man, the penalties would be more severe for Black assailants for these crimes. And so while you have a slate of laws with that level of specificity for the rape or attempted rape of white women and girls, the same statutes make no mention of any punishment at all for the rape or attempted rape of a Black woman or Black girl by either a white or Black man. So this is a way that the legal system basically leaves Black women vulnerable to violence and sexual assault. And at the same time, what springs up alongside these odious sort of practices is this myth that Black women are especially immoral and licentious, right? They don't have any virtue to protect. And one of the things that I argue is that those harmful narratives those stereotypes about Black women and Black womanhood, they endure long after the end of enslavement. And so that it's this kind of bias and bigotry that Black women are up against in the period that I study, which is the late 19th and the early 20th century.
What role does abortion play in your pages, and what role does infanticide play in your pages?
Right. So this is one of the things that I look at as ways that Black women took control of their reproductive systems. And this is really important for Black women. Historically, we know Black women were assaulted, forced to breed during enslavement. And there's evidence that Black women also committed infanticide in those instances too. But in the post-emancipation period, you have Black women really trying to define Black womanhood for themselves, right? They want to assert their own kind of femininity. They want to protect their own virtue. They're figuring out how to define their honor and womanhood. And there are huge stigmas against any women who are having a child out of wedlock. And it doesn't matter if that child is conceived by, rape, or if seduction, or, you wanted to have sex with someone and you ended up getting pregnant. Whatever the case, if you were pregnant and unwed, a young woman, you were in a bad situation. And so many Black women found ways to take control of their reproductive systems. They sought out local, root doctors and took all kinds of potions that operated as abortifacients, things that would induce menstruation. But these could be hugely dangerous. They were very toxic and they could be fatally so. The other ways that Black women attempted to, they actually sought out abortions and medical kinds of procedures by people with very little training and, unsanitized circumstances. And so these kinds of procedures left the women really vulnerable to death also, because they could suffer really bad infections and end up dying this way. So it's kind of, it's sort of an ironic kind of twist, but if you were a young woman in this period who was, in trouble, quote unquote, and you really wanted to live and prioritize yourself, it seems like the safest thing to do would be to wait and to deliver and then to try to discard the fetus after you gave birth. And that's what a number of these young women did. And one of the other sort of ironic things that I've noticed is that they seem to have a greater measure of sympathy in some respects for women in these circumstances in the past than they do today. So a lot of times justices and juries look for any reason to kind of acquit the women. So no matter what the circumstances, if a young woman said that the infant was stillborn, even if they had doctors come in and testify that there was air in the lungs, a lot of times the juries would just go with that and acquit the women. And so I think it's ironic because it's one of the few places where I've actually seen Black women treated similarly to white women for this type of crime.
Any hypothesis on that latter point?
I think, as I said, I think it's just this ironic kind of outcome where most of the times you have Black women's womanhood being questioned and, dismissed at every turn. They don't benefit from chivalry in the legal system under most circumstances, but somehow through these crimes, that level of desperation around wanting to control their reproductive systems and not wanting to have, the shame or stigma of being pregnant and unwed assigned to them is what seems to also kind of confer their belonging into the category of woman.
Now, what about the major victims of these of the fury of these Black women? Were they white men, Black men, white women? And a note on each of those categories, if you don't mind.
So all of the above. Most of the times when the victims are Black men, they're usually intimate partners who, they're in a heated dispute. There's some sort of, domestic violence in the household, and the women, take matters into their own hands. They know the police are not going to help them. So if they want to survive or stand up for themselves, and have to do it themselves. In terms of white folks, this usually happens at the job, right? Black women are overwhelmingly employed as domestics, and so in white homes. And so a lot of times when they have these violent or deadly encounters with whites, it's usually under these circumstances. One of my favorite cases actually involves a Black woman named Mary Wright in 1901. Her, 78-year-old boss, a white woman named Sarah Higginbotham, is found brutally murdered in her home, like brutally murdered, beaten, battered, her skull's cracked. And the Black maid is the only woman in the house at the time, Mary Wright. So she's promptly arrested, and it looks like she's just going down. It's going to be an open and shut case. But, what happens is Mary Wright starts mobilizing all of those tactics. She starts spilling the tea on the information in the family. Turns out that the youngest son was marrying a woman that the mother didn't approve of. He also had a substance abuse problem. There's a lot of traffic in and out of the home. And this was one of these sort of wealthy, storied families. So it goes from this case where it's like, violent Black maid, brutally murders this, revered matriarch of a Philadelphia family to, is the son involved? What's going on? It's like scandalous all over the place. And it looks like it's going to be this David and Goliath kind of battle because the family is incredibly wealthy. They mobilize their contacts in the press against her. And what happens is that members of her church rally to her defense. They fundraise, they hire her an attorney. And so all of a sudden, Mary is in this. So that's one of those cases where we see that this change kind of occur. And I don't want to sort of give away the ending, but it's one of my favorite cases. So that's one of my favorite cases in terms of Black women fighting and mobilizing everything and anything. But those are the places where the victims are white. It tends to happen on the job. The other spaces where it can happen are when Black women are in transit. So if they're taking a trolley, they're walking to and from work, they're on the street, they have to encounter, men and boys. And there's a lot of disrespect there too. People are, groping them, saying vile things. It can be really a harrowing experience. But then you have some women, like another one of my favorites is Nancy Lukens, trying to walk down the street and a kid's rude and decides to blow cigarette smoke in her face, and he ends up getting knocked out for his trouble. So those are some of the cases. Hopefully, are those some of the notes that you're looking for, Gerald? Or you want me to, I don't want to bore your listeners.
Oh, no, not at all. This is highly informative. You can continue.
Okay, so that's so those are some of the main examples of it's in those spaces, in that transit where you have people just thinking that it's acceptable to disrespect Black women. And what I love about their responses in this moment, that fire, that heat, is that it's a revolutionary act really for them to stand up for themselves in this way, because this is an era where the legal system in a number of the states still set aside a space for white men to violently avenge dishonor through duels. So you have the law being, saying it's okay for white men to, they've been besmirched, right? They have the space to use violence to address that. And so, in the same time, Black women are expected to suffer any and every, indignity, disrespect, violation of their personhood. You're supposed to just accept it and shoulder on. And I don't want to give you a wrong impression. Many Black women did, but vengeance feminists did not. They stood up and defended their own honor.
Finally, colleague Nicole Gross, NEH Professor of African American Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, author of the book Vengeance Feminism. What's next on your agenda?
I am looking at the experience of Black women in capital punishment in the United States. I was initially going to emphasize the electric chair, but I'm thinking of expanding it ever since I realized that the majority of women burned at the stake in the US were Black.
Burned at the stake as witches?
Burned at the stake for arson and for killing enslavers.
Well, we look forward with eager anticipation to that work, Professor Gross, author of the book Vengeance Feminism. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you for having me.
Nobody will miss you. Sankofa. Come on. Can soda. Cincinnati.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Albert Camarillo, Thomas Blakeslee, and Kali Nicole Gross. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder and ancestor, Baba Didan Kamati. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We're proud to be black. Black is beautiful, baby. It's pretty. Black is beautiful. Black is beautiful. Black power means dignity. It means we're gonna walk side by side with you or through you. We're gonna be with dignity and integrity. We don't want any more than you have, and we're not gonna accept any less than you have. That's black power.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.